You're about to watch a recorded session from the Brand Podcast Summit. For more recordings or information on the podcasting events we have coming up very soon, go to brandpodcastsummit.com.
The Brand Podcast Summit.
So the first session today is bringing together some excellent marketers. We've got Lynn Teo of the Northwestern Mutual. We have Nick Howard of Boston Consulting Group, Roy Sexton of Clark Hill Law, and this session is going to be led by Shannon Martin. So the topic of the panel that we have now is podcasting for brands in 2024. So a little bit more information. Lynn is the Chief Marketing Officer at Northwestern Mutual, and she specializes in driving growth through modern marketing capabilities. Nick has possibly the coolest job title. He is the podcast architect and senior manager at Boston Consulting Group. He leads the storytelling team, developing podcasts, video content, and more from BCG audiences. And finally, but certainly not leastly, Roy is the director of marketing at Clark Hill Law, and he loves problem solving and crafting new communication strategies, and has already experimented with podcasting. In fact, he's got a lot of experience in this area that he's going to be sharing with us today, as well as all of our other panelists. The session is led by Shannon, who is our podcast strategist here at Lower Street. She's got over 8 years experience in podcasting as the head of communications at Podbean. So you're in very capable hands here, and I'm really interested to see what you all have to say about podcasting in the year ahead. So thank you all. Take it away.
Great. Thank you. I'm excited to be here with this esteemed panel. And so we'll just dive right in, and I'll kind of direct questions around as we go, and we'll have a great discussion hopefully about podcasting. And just to start with our title of our session here today, I'd love to hear from each of you about kind of what you're excited about when it comes to podcasting and content marketing in 2024, what you're hoping to achieve, in this year with podcasting, and overall content marketing. And I'll just go in the order of the screen that I have here. So Roy, if you could start us off.
Sure. And I probably should offer some context for the way we are using podcasting at Clark Hill. And so it'll frame maybe where I am in terms of where we are in our journey and what we're excited about. So for a law firm, and I won't get too pedantic, but when you think about the business model of a law firm, and it's probably not dissimilar from some of what Northwestern and BCG are doing, the product I'm selling are the attorneys and what's in their heads. Sometimes the attorneys think I'm selling their social skills. Not so much. What I'm selling is the intelligence they can provide. And also, when you think about picking an attorney, it's much like picking a therapist or an accountant. Do you want to see, does this personality fit with my need? And I'm assuming they're a good attorney. Do they have insight? And to me, podcasting is one of the best ways to engage that storytelling element, to lean into their natural tendency toward introversion, which a lot of them have, but that they are gregarious. So in a podcast environment, they can have that one-on-one. I can relate to that myself. I clam up in a cocktail party, but something like this, you can't get me to shut up. So when we launched our podcasts, and this is about 3 or 4 years ago, and we have 6 different series we run now, we really built them around individual personalities. And I wonder if that was the right call or not, but I think it's a little different than what many firms do. Many firms will do kind of a broad-based, here is estate and tax, here's litigation. We built it around individuals who have that personality that can carry the program. So for me, my interest is in continuing to build out the quality of the podcast. I know many would go into, well, how is AI going to help in terms of content development and search and placement and reach and all that? And, a lot of the technological audience building on the back end, I think that's important. But at the end of the day, if you put together content that people want to listen to, tune into, that they have interesting guests, that we lean into the strategy of identifying current clients and prospects that also have their own following, I think people will tune in, and we have seen that to be true. And I think, if anything, I'd like to get back to brass tacks a little bit and get to working with the individuals who are our talent, for lack of a better term, running the podcast and saying, what's working for you, what isn't? I'm a theater person by training, so I want to get back to actually the audience experience and building up the skills and talent of the people that we have hosting these programs. So bit of a ramble, I suppose, but I wanted to make sure I offered some of the context and the thinking. I'm probably not at the level of sophistication of our other two panelists, but I'll be honest about that through the course of our conversation too. So
thanks. That was really insightful, I think, in just terms of how different brands think about podcasting. And I think really interesting approach, building around that individual expertise. Podcast hosts, there is an intimacy with podcast hosts. So I think wouldn't say that was a wrong move, but it'd be interesting to see kind of how things proceed for you all moving forward.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much. And Lynn, why don't you share a little bit about your sort of podcasting plans and excitement and content marketing for this coming year?
Sure thing. So first of all, I just wanted to say, it's always brilliant when you see parallels between the worlds of your panelists. So Roy, we're looking to learn from you and what's taken off for your firm. But I do think that underscoring what Roy said, this notion of podcast being an excellent platform for the delivery of information that, is very much an expertise-led profession. I think, whether you're an accountant, a financial advisor, there is the assumption that, a professional has all of the latest in that particular discipline. So I want to maybe provide a construct for folks to think about. And I call them the 4 E's when I think about podcasts. The first one is certainly the expertise platform. So you always pick the right tool for the job. And I see podcasts as being the right tool for the dissemination of expertise, right? There is also a dialogue element in a podcast, which I think just makes for a much more dynamic, engaging platform. And that brings me to my second E, which is engagement. And I think what I love about podcasts is you have that real-time element. Most times it is unscripted. So you get to see the personality of the person and you see the interaction between, the members or the people who are on the podcast. And I think it's that dynamism and people offering up various points of view and playing off each other that is very enriching, I think, for a listener. The third E is education. I think brands that connect best with consumers are brands that earn the right for attention. And I think when you're tackling a really complex topic area, being able to educate, in my opinion, is the best way for any brand to really serve their target audiences. And then the rest will follow. The last one, and I will not put it past, any lifestyle platform or channel, is entertainment. People listen to podcasts because they want to be entertained. So I think there's that element of, are there audio elements that you can infuse that really take advantage of the platform? So those are the 4 E's, and I'll leave that as a construct for the listeners.
Thank you, Lynn. That's exciting. I'm taking notes. I hope everyone jotted down the 4 E's because that's a great way of framing it. And I loved all of those points. So that's a really good context to get us started. So thank you so much. And Nick, I know podcasting is your world. So tell us, what we have to look forward to in 2024.
Absolutely. Yeah. Between you, Lynn and Roy, you haven't given me much left to say. So like in 2024, so to give some context, BCG, I joined about 3 years ago. We've had a podcast strategy, which, this is a company of 30,000 people across the world, and podcasts, they are an easy thing to start, a really hard thing to actually sustain, I would say. So a lot of my job is around channeling people's enthusiasm and making something that can actually keep going. We're in the 3rd year of our thought leadership podcast, The So What. We are in the 2nd year of some of our other smaller projects, things like Climate Vision, a soundscape of answering questions around what the world will look like in 2050 in a net zero world. And I think that when we look at 2024, the idea is to actually capture, I think, Lynn, what you were saying with that 4th E. I always go on the basis that if people are listening to a branded podcast, that is a gift. Because the listener could be using that time to do a whole range of other things. We're not competing just for time with other corporate levers, other sort of newsletters, that kind of thing, or even other podcasts. Like, I could be taking a walk. I could be, watching a TV show. I could be spending my time in valuable ways that are valuable to me. Like, why should the listener give me that half an hour of their time? So entertainment, actually getting people who are, who work for companies who are not necessarily raconteurs and, who are not comfortable at controversy and things like this, to actually think in terms of like, what is the hook here? Like, why should someone listen to me? Podcasts that are less around, these are, the advice is to be a success. Podcasts which are more around, these were the 3 mistakes I made, don't make them. So yeah, 2024, I think we'll be bombarded with, suggestions about the move to YouTube in terms of video and audio, opportunities to engage with AI in our sort of workflow. But to echo Roy, I think a lot of 2024 is trying to stay on target with, why are these podcasts here? Why are we making them? And why should people actually listen to them?
That's great. And that leads directly into something else I'd like to ask about, which is kind of trends and changes. So Nick, do you mind sort of continuing on with that a bit? I'd love to hear, what you saw in 2023 and what you're looking to change going into this coming year, and just any thoughts on big kind of trends you see in podcasting, and we'll go around.
Yeah, so I think I mentioned the big 2, which are, the amount of times that I've been asked about, where we move to video in terms of podcasting. I'm quite old school. To me, podcasting is still an audio first medium. And I think that to an extent, video is something we're going to have to be fairly careful about, in that, there are potential audiences there, but the more you work with video, the more you are competing with the BBC, NBC, all of the broadcasting professionals around the world who have studios and ways to do this. So I think that is something that, all companies will be working out how to target that. And I say that as, this is something at BCG that we're thinking about as well. When it comes to AI, which is going to be the other big conversation, I'm an AI optimist, but an AI realist right now, that I think, 2024 is still pretty early in terms of the technologies. I think people are going to waste a hell of a lot of money in 2024 on various AI technologies, etc. But the trick will be finding the right ones and getting ahead and so forth. But I do think that the trends I'm more interested in are companies embracing more, going from just interview podcasts to more storytelling podcasts. And this is, not necessarily something that is super new, but I want companies to be thinking not how do I make my latest report into a podcast, like how do I make the airport novel of podcasts that people want to consume, that have hooks built in, that knows the rhythm of a story and things. I think that's much more interesting. And I think people are grappling with it much more. There's, obviously the huge amount of talent that is in the industry now as well.
It may tag on to that. For me, from a trend perspective, I spot on it. And I'm not a Luddite, but I'm more agnostic about AI than probably just about anybody else. I just wrote a piece, and it's probably going to get me in trouble, where I said, I tire every year of going to all the conferences and hearing whatever it is that we're all obsessed about, because as marketers, we want to seem smart, but we don't know what we're talking about. Right now, it's AI. Used to be blockchain. Then it was NFT. Then it was Clubhouse. Then it was Internet of Things, big data. We just throw these things out there for about a year and a half. No one says anything of any substance. And then it's already happening in the background. We've had AI for 20 years. It's been in our cell phones, everything. It exhausts me a little bit, unless people are talking about what they're doing with it to understand their market and to target people. I don't need AI to create content for me. I'm a creative person. It annoys me. In fact, I can tell when AI is created content, it doesn't sell, it doesn't engage. But if you're going to use AI behind the scenes to refine the delivery of your product, very interested in that. So that is sort of a broad brush, probably triggering a reaction to all the chatter about AI. But and so because of that, I feel a couple things are going to happen. I think we're going to see an increasing market consolidation in podcasting. The barrier to entry is low. The barrier to success is high. And we saw the pandemic. I don't know how many basement podcasts I myself appeared on that now are disappeared, because everyone's like, and they do 5 or 6 episodes and nothing comes of it, because they don't know the steady, consistent approach with a storytelling bent is what people are going to tune in for. So I think we're going to see fewer of these, better, because people are just going to exit the effort because it is a lot of work. But for the right voice and the right audience, it works really effectively. I also think the length of these things hopefully is going to get even shorter. I think we've always known a 15-minute, 20-minute for the kind of thing we're doing, at least in the legal side, is far more effective than someone bloviating for an hour. No one wants to tune in for that. I would only beg to differ a little with Nick on the video piece in that what I've seen, at least in our space, different people have different absorption and learning styles. So start and focus on the audio. I agree. Make that good, make it crisp. But if you have a camera on, do a snip of video, consolidate down the data points. This is where AI can help you because it can go through the podcast quickly and pull out the transcript. Have a written transcript, because if I'm sitting there watching Reacher with my husband, I'm not going to be listening to the podcast. But if the transcript is there, and God forbid, please proofread that transcript. I'm so tired of seeing transcripts that people just slap up there and don't read. Boy, I sound cranky this morning or afternoon or wherever you are. So have it in multiple ways for different learning styles. We are talking about podcasts, so audio first, but there are people that I like that there's a podcast. If I'm driving, I want to listen to it. If I'm sitting in an airport or in front of the TV, I'd rather read it. So I think if you've got the content, deliver it in multiple ways. And I think the other thing I think we'll see people do more, I hope, is once you're sitting on this mountain of content, don't just one and done it. Take that episode, if it's evergreen, rerun it, snip some clips, use it on social media, keep driving people back to it, because that's going to help you in search, and why it's a good marketing technique. Once you've created it, you want to make sure as many people see it as possible. I guess the last point I will leave, and this is just a bugaboo for me, I do a lot of local theater, and we'll be rehearsing for 6 weeks, and then the performance is about to come, and then I'll say, oh, who do you have coming? Oh, I didn't tell anybody about this. Why not? Well, I might be embarrassed. I said, well, you weren't embarrassed to audition, but now you're embarrassed to have anybody come see it. Why bother? And I feel like that happens a lot with the podcast. People create it and they just sort of put it out there. People will find it. I don't want to seem like I'm bragging. I need to be humble. I don't want people to think I'm egocentric. You're egocentric enough to decide to do a podcast. Tell people about it. Thank you. Welcome to my TED Talk.
Oh, that was great. Shannon, I'll just kind of maybe lend my point of view here. So I think the important thing, in terms of trends for 24 is I think about every marketer having a toolkit of various tactics and channels in which strategies come to life, right? And so my encouragement to marketers would be to think about where your podcast is fitting in your funnel. And I'm using funnel just as a way to help marketers frame up their thinking, right? Is this a way for you to attract brand new target audiences and segments that you may have missed, right? So as I think about the statistics behind podcast listeners in the US, I mean, they're really skewing young. We're talking 18 to 35 being the fastest growing segment. The US also happens to have the largest chunk of the world of podcast listeners. So that's extremely relevant to my business. I'm a US-based financial services company. And I also think about what the demographics are by way of, the affluence of most people. The segment does, rise up in the 100 to 150K household income. So I'm thinking of podcasts no different than if I was thinking through what are my media spends, right? How should I be reaching out? What content should I be putting out on TikTok versus Instagram versus LinkedIn? So really adopt a systems view of really talking about thinking through where does your podcast strategy sit? Because podcasts can have a job to do in the middle funnel. Because in the middle funnel, you really want people to consider you, right? Alongside maybe other brands. But you also want to take that moment, and that therein lies your expertise element for the brand to be able to demonstrate how your point of view about your product or service is different. So I think the takeaway here is I'm seeing the trend of, not just going off and creating a podcast because it's easy to put one out, but to integrate it in your planning activities so that the outcomes that you're driving are connected to your other marketing tactics.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I really want to let you know that if you're enjoying this content, you're going to love what we have coming up very soon. Another brand podcasting event that goes even deeper into what we're discussing in this session. So for more information on that, please go to brandpodcastsummit.com. And if you're watching this session and you're finding yourself thinking, this is all great, but like, how am I going to get this started this week? You know, I need some help with my brand's podcast. We'd love to have a chat about what you're working on. You can find all the information on how to contact us at lowerstreet.co. We also have a bunch of case studies and some examples of the things that we've been working on to give you a sense of what that looks like. So yeah, if you want help with your brand podcast, go to lowerstreet.co. And now back to what you're watching. Thanks.
That's great. You can tell we have some brilliant minds here. We've gotten quite a range of thoughts on these trends, and I like how you're grounding this, you know, in the overall strategy, Lynn. That makes so much sense. And so let's see. Any controversies that anyone wanted to pick up on there? Any arguments to the contrary?
Well,
anything?
You want meat, red meat? I'm a vegetarian. I don't like red meat. I would say it's not controversy. I want to reiterate. I want to mansplain. No, I want to reiterate what Lynn just said about. We are here talking about podcasting, but for Lynn and I, for both of us, English major who doesn't remember grammar anymore, you got to look at the full picture of your delivery mechanism of content. And I love the funnel, and it's funny in legal. I love that you said the funnel, because I talk about the funnel all the time, and people blank stare back at me. What are you talking about? Legal marketers. I don't know what that means. I'm like, you got to move people from here to here. It's not a hard concept. But I feel like that's so crucial. If you're generating content, what are you doing with it? And what are the various mechanisms? There's a question in the chat about that. How do you know what to place where? And I don't know that we're going to get to that during this course of the conversation, but this is a nice big hub around which to create a good amount of content, but then think about all the channels you're using for distribution, and think about your overall strategy, and look at the reach and the effectiveness. And quite frankly, if you have a podcast nobody's listening to, it's time to retool that and pull back, because on our end, we're a corporate resource and we have a finite amount of money, but we also have a finite amount of time. And podcasts should not just exist to placate somebody's ego in your organization that has a big book of business or thinks they're really important. If it's not bringing in either leads or awareness or audience growth, you need to find a way to pull a plug or retool, or at least mix up who's on air, because they're not bringing in the numbers. You got to think like I sometimes think I'm running a hometown newspaper and a television station that no one really wants to watch. But, you know, because I got to think about my media mix and what people are tuning in for. That's how we have to think these days as marketers.
When I jump in on that, I think I agree. I also think that this shouldn't just be a marketing piece as well. That's, as you say, like there is a purpose to this. This is about generating new clients or building relationships with existing ones, or also increasing your recruitment, you know, getting people to actually know that you exist and come work for you. So also that perhaps it's your recruitment wing that actually, know about the podcast, feel an ownership for it. Your sales team, when your, top level people go out for lunch with various clients, and that client says, "Hey, I loved you on that podcast." Like the marketing team should know about that. There should be some kind of process that information comes back, that it shouldn't just be the marketing team who own the podcast kind of thing.
And Shannon's like, I'm never going to rein him back in. Market that then back within your organization. Now, we have 27 offices, 700 attorneys. It's a big organization, but it also feels like a lot of small provincial organizations at the same time. And I say that with love. So one of the things I've done every law firm I work in is when we're doing things like this, I can't just trust that they're looking at the website or checking out our social media. And in fact, many aren't. They think they're above that sometimes. So I do go back within, have your internal newsletter, use your intranet, pull clips, let people know this exists, celebrate. And when you get an anecdote like that, don't be shy about emailing that to the C-suite, putting it in your newsletters, if all you have is Canva, create a graphic. If you have a design team, put placards together that say, this is the feedback we got, solicit that feedback actively, and use it as a promotional tool, both within your organization and outside. Because sometimes your best audience, if you're a big organization, probably like Northwestern or BCG, your own people need to be listening to your podcast to know what you're all about. So
I love that, Roy. That's actually, I'm just going to take the audio clip from that and play it in our presentation later. Hannah and I are talking about podcast growth, and that's one of the things we're talking about. And so and you said it better than I probably will. So I love that. Yeah, really getting those internal champions and making sure they're listening, I think is so great. And speaking of that, and some of the great advice you all have given, and you've kind of mentioned a few things along the way as you've been talking about different aspects, but I'm curious to think now sort of to help people, that might be listening about what they can do better, what you're even looking to do better. So, what are some of the mistakes that maybe you or your organization have made, or that you see commonly that other organizations are making when it comes to podcasting that we could, turn around for 2024? Lynn, do you want to share any of that?
Yeah, maybe not so much mistakes, but reflect on prior attempts at launching podcasts, right? And reflect on them. There are many reasons, like I remember when I came to Northwestern Mutual, I was in a learning mode, and I said, help me understand what's been put in place before. And so there was a time when the podcast was used as a channel that supplemented the dissemination of information. So we have a chief investment officer, right? There's a point of view about how Northwestern Mutual, believes we should grow the portfolios of our clients, right? So, but I think about that as a prior version of how podcasts were launched. That doesn't take advantage of the full breadth. So I would say if you have a blog, and Northwestern Mutual has Life and Money on our on our website, go there for your first kind of cut of data about what topics are resonating with your audience, right? That becomes your starting point. And then build on that further to say that, okay, who are the experts that I have in my brand, then can lend a unique lens to that. So I'm a firm believer of building on things that work and having the data to confirm and validate.
Thank you. That's wonderful. And anybody else want to throw out any kind of mistakes they see? And then we also can start taking some audience questions.
I'll offer the mistakes. And I also, thanks to my new friends in the chat, we can't comment in the chat, and it's probably good because I'd be distracted, but there's some lovely comments for all of us in there. Thank you all. I'm sure all of us would love to be connected with you on LinkedIn, so find us there, and we can pick this up otherwise. We have made mistakes. We continue to make mistakes. I would say one of the whoppers from the beginning was we let the tail wag the dog. And if someone said they wanted to do a podcast, we kind of let them run with it. And then later tried to figure out how to rein it back in. And so we'd have attorneys and this is if you're in professional services, it costs you, your attorney, if they build the podcast around themselves, they think it's theirs to leave when they leave the organization. And we had a couple of instances where we put a lot of time and energy into this podcast, and the attorney left, and they're like, it's mine, right? And there was no clarity around who owned the intellectual property of it. So we didn't let that happen again. Now when we start a podcast, we say, oh, you're interested? Thanks. We'll work on the concept. We'll come back to you. And it's marketing 101. And I knew that in all other things. Podcast felt different. Now, this is 4 or 5 years ago, but I offer it honestly because other people might find themselves, if they're in a smaller organization, they're trying to get into this, you're making some concessions. You're getting somebody to do something that's uncomfortable for them. And so they feel they own it. It's theirs. And you have to be really clear at the front end. This is the firm or the corporation's money and resource that's going into the development of this. You are our talent. We appreciate you, but this podcast will continue should you leave the organization. And that's a mistake we made early on. We don't make again. I think the other mistake we've made that I would walk back a little bit, because I said this earlier, we built it around the talent. We made sure it was clear to them it's our podcast, but I think we didn't build in enough access points that we could swap in other hosts and other things. So they're aligned by practice area and industry team, but we haven't built in enough kind of variants of host, because we've got some that have trailed off because they just don't have time. It worked. Their business is booming, so they don't want to record episodes anymore. But now I have this podcast out there that hasn't had an episode since June of last year. And we haven't got a mechanism for continuing that with other folks because, again, this attorney, big book of business, big ego. What do you mean someone else is going to host my podcast? It's not your podcast. So that's a mistake you can tell we still make in various permutations. We haven't quite solved for it. But I would say the other thing I would caution marketers, it's easy to feel bad that your podcast has fallen off. Don't worry about it. No one's paying that much attention to the date and time unless it's a seasonal episode or a very time-sensitive issue. The content's out there and it will be out there forever. And if you have a mix of folks and you've got like our immigration podcast, that woman records them almost every other week. So she's keeping the fire burning for almost all our other series right now. That's fine. Keep it in the mix. Have it all on one page where people can find the array of your podcast. They can find that content and it's going to come up in search. So again, as a supplement to your funnel and your communications platform, you're going to be on various aspects of sophistication here. Some of you are going to be like Nick, where you're the podcast guru and you've got it down. And some of you are going to be like me, where it's part of your mix and you're doing a lot of other things, and that's okay. Don't beat yourself up that you're at a different phase of your development sophistication.
If I can add one thing, because Roy, I agree with all of that. And it's interesting seeing that's resonating in the chat as well, that balance between podcasting is so personal. So, the host, whoever that is always going to be linked to it. And whether you build that in, having multiple hosts right from the beginning, it's it's always going to be complicated. So the other thing that I would just say in terms of like a learning for us was, so one podcast every 2 weeks, a different topic every 2 weeks, thought leadership. At the beginning, we wanted to be extremely flexible, extremely, relating to, the company's goals. We shifted with different campaigns, different priorities, etc. And the problem with that is that, sometimes that can mean that you're burning hot at one part of the year, much cooler at the other times of the year, trying to find content, etc. You get bits of repetition, etc. Hey, it's climate month. So I would say, like, have a strategy for your content 3-6 months in advance, a year in advance if you can. Have flexibility within that so that you can turn on a dime, but you also know what you are going to be doing in 6 months' time. And that can also be a boon when, to take Roy's example, some attorney comes to you, says they want to do a topic that is, you reckon, incredibly boring, and you can point to the strategy and say, I am so sorry, we don't have room for you at the moment. We'll see you next year. So yeah, that would be a learning for us.
There are a couple of things in the chat. One is housekeeping. Someone asked how to find us on LinkedIn. I think just searching for us, but also if you click our bios, I think in the agenda, all of our links are available there. So you can check us out that way. And I want to shout out Sally LePage, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing. It might not be the presenter's podcast, but the audience may be listening for them. So you need to be incredibly careful changing over presenters. So you taught me something, because it's honestly something I've felt a little guilty about, but you're absolutely right. They are listening for the individual. And if you do this correctly, you don't want to make it too easy to bolt in and bolt out talent. I mean, it's like anything. It's like the Tonight Show when they get a new host. It's like, do we accept this change or do we not? So it was a really insightful comment and helpful to me, quite frankly, to read. So
thank you. Lots of important things for companies, for people to consider, I think, with a lot of what you all are bringing up. So it's really useful. I don't know if Stephen wants to come in with any questions from the audience.
Hi, hello. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone. Stephen Bernard here, so from the Lower Street team, to handle the Q&A. So thanks to everyone who's been sending over questions. Just a quick housekeeping rule: if you want to ask questions, please do use the Q&A feature. It's much easier for me to pick them up. But yeah, so we've got some really interesting questions from the audience. I'm going to start with Queen's question, which is it's not directed to anyone in particular, so anyone wants to pick up this one. But Queen was asking, do you think the number of listeners matters more than engagement? I.e., if you say that you have 500 very engaged listeners versus 10K not engaged, what's best?
I mean, I would say, Lynn, go for it.
Sure. I do think you want to strike a healthy balance between the two. There's no sense in having a podcast if, to your point, you have 50 or 500. Depends on the size of your target audience. So I would say you want to see a nice, healthy addition or expansion of your targets. The whole point of doing this, well, for my strategy at least, is to reach people that we would otherwise not have reached had we just focused on the channels, right? So that's kind of baked into my content marketing strategy and pillar for 24 is reach. The second one about engagement, I just think that as you think about the system of touches between all of the other channels. I do think the engagement is critical because there's a finite amount of time during the podcast, right, where you're able to interact. But I think more importantly, what's the call to action? You want the dialogue, you want the listener to continue the engagement with the brand. So in my kind of world, I find that the connectivity between channels is not well established. So, it's critical for me to see that after they listen to a podcast, maybe they download a white paper, they start to provide information a little bit about who they are. It feeds our first party data, right? And then it kind of builds the journey of nurturing. So that would be kind of my 2 cents on that.
Nick, can I throw in, just because it fits what I want to say, is also think about what your business model is. How do you make your margins? For a law firm, getting 10 or 20 listeners, we want more than 10 or 20 listeners, but 10 or 20 listeners, that can pay for 8 podcasts over and over. If I'm selling movie tickets, not so much. So, think about what your business is. Is it on volume or is it on targeted audience? And there's another question in the chat about how to use this for account-based marketing. We actually have in some instances. So we tie-barred our creative in the account-based marketing space back to some of the podcasts to grow audience by making sure we were looking at title, geography, company, and we were kind of actively and passively soliciting them through account-based marketing and more display advertising, but bringing people back to the podcast to grow the audience if that helps that person. But
that's excellent. And also we'll talk more about it in our growth session today. As someone, I saw something in the comments about data and measurement. So that is going to be a piece at the end of that session, which we'll really get into. And this question is part of what we're going to talk about. That important mix. I love what Lynn said about that. And with account-based marketing, a lot of times it's also related to the guests on the podcast. And we've seen that be super successful in legal marketing and other areas. So Nick, I think you were going to share something on that?
To be honest, between Lynn and Roy, they took everything I was going to say. No, that was fantastic. So no need to hear from me.
Thanks very much, everyone. That was so insightful. Then we've got time for, I think, one more question, perhaps, or two. But Maggie was asking, how do you strike a balance between thought leadership and storytelling? My brand has experts, educated, and the authority to dive into deep and complex topics for rich discussions and interviews. But I keep hearing that storytelling format are the most engaging, I guess, for a brand. What's your take on that?
I would say that storytelling often gets misunderstood as that it's got to be a script written, a narrative, actors, a full drama, etc. I think that the most intelligent experts that I've heard, the most compelling experts that I've heard on podcasts are able to incorporate stories into how they show their expertise. And that isn't just, I was walking along and blah, 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 suddenly this happened. It's about creating an emotional context to the information you're trying to give across. I would say that for a branded podcast, I'd be hesitant about the 3-hour deep dive into content anyway, as that can be a white paper, that can be an email, etc. I think for branded podcasts, my advice would be shorter anyway, which means that deep dive is harder. But that story of back and forth conversation, the way that you would transmit that information in a dinner party setting or something. Maybe I'm too boring at dinner parties. But the point is that, it's about incorporating storytelling into how you transmit the expertise rather than an either or would be my take.
Yeah, an interview can be storytelling. And if you think about late night talk shows, they start with a monologue or, I sound corny, but I look at people like Oprah Winfrey and others that do such a lovely job because they make the interview part of their story and you personalize. Hopefully the guest is someone the host has a connection point with. You can still have an interview and talk about substantive, detailed, tactical information while still saying, boy, when we were having dinner the other night, so storytelling elements are really about, almost we should strike the word storytelling and talk about humanizing the content. Oh, Lynn just passed out. Where'd she go? Oh, there she is.
That was hilarious. That was a priceless moment. Poof.
I love the discussion around it's not an either or, because I do think that is sometimes people think when you're saying that you're asking them to go in a different direction than they maybe had. But there are also examples of sort of taking it to a creative storytelling level. And Nick, maybe if I don't know if you want to we'll brag on you for a little bit, but you had the Climate Vision 2050 podcast last year was a great example of sort of taking that creative leap.
Yeah, no, thanks for the opportunity. So to give you some context, so last year or the very end of the year before, people came to me and said, we want to make a climate podcast. And I said, we can, but that's going to be really boring. No one's going to listen to it. No one wants to be told for half an hour to fly less and use fewer plastic bags. Everyone believes that is true, but they don't want to actually commit the time. What we did instead was we brought in actors, we brought in script writers, we brought in experts as well, academic experts, our own consultant experts as well. And we set a short form, so 8 episodes, each episode focusing on a different topic of the year is 2050. We've made it. We fixed climate. It was really hard, but this is how we did it, and this is the world that we now live in. Each episode had a narrative running through it that had an emotional core to it. You know, someone trying to get home to for the birth of their child via electric planes. You know, this kind of stuff. So I would say that, we won a bunch of awards. We got a huge audience for it. We were, number one at on the Apple charts for a lot last year. So it can work. It was more of an ask in terms of the team, but it allowed us to tell a story that if we'd just gone for a normal interview format would have been, I don't want to say dull, but a lot less engaging. So yeah, maybe it isn't a case of either or. Also in terms of you've got expertise, but you can also transmit that through a more innovative format as well, because particularly when it needs that push to actually get an audience to engage, something different is, that's what we all want.
What I love about that, oh, no, go.
Oh, thank you. I would be very kind of more tangible about it. I think an area of inspiration for the storytelling build-up is case studies, right? As I think about how these case studies are conveyed on websites, et cetera, I'm actually inspired by the stories that our financial advisors tell during our regional events or our annual meetings. And these are very, very touching moments where the financial advisors have a client on stage with them. And they talk about how some of these seemingly complex financial decisions were simplified at moments of time in their lives, and how at points of duress, the client received a tremendous amount of support, right? You're never able to tell that story in as multifaceted a way. And I think the podcast storytelling element lets you bring kind of high emotion topics to the fore. Over to you, Roy.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. Joelle Knoll, again, hopefully I'm not mispronouncing, has this lovely comment in the chat. Using story enables the podcast to show versus tell when it comes to expertise and thought leadership. And the other comment I was going to make, both in reference to what Nick and Lynn were saying, we tend to get in our pocket when we're in corporate America. We feel like it must be a little dry and dull, and that's what we do, or we don't have the resources to be creative in the way Nick is describing. I have no restraint, as you can see, in my background, and my poor husband things come from Amazon all the time. He's like, where's that going to go? But I am very interested in what is our human experience absorbing narrative, whether it's marketing narrative, entertainment narrative, whatever. It is shaping how all of us consume content, whether it's dry or entertainment. So what changed in the way we consume television? How we think in buckets. We think in a mini-series style when we watch Netflix or any number of things, or when we're shopping. That influences the way we are selling law firms and accountancies and consultants. Don't be shy about doing what Nick is proposing, but maybe you do it on a scale that's available for you. And you might have some internal people that fight you on this generationally. They're like, we don't do things like that here. Why not? Because or law firms will joke they like to be first to be second. Is another law firm doing that? I don't know that I want to do that. Well, if another law firm's doing it, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be where the other law firms are. I want to be somewhere else. I want to make a splash that is consistent with our brand, that doesn't make us look foolish. That's my problem, not yours. So you're going to have the internal constituency that fights you on doing something unusual, like Nick described, but it's exactly the kind of thing you should be exploring. Will you be able to do it at the level he is? Probably not. But looking, if you're like me and you watch television and movies and things, what is resonating for you? Why? Why is that resonating? And can you borrow some of that into what you're creating from a marketing perspective?
Well, This has been absolutely brilliant. We could probably talk for many more hours on podcasting. Maybe we'll all get together for a chat on LinkedIn or something later. Thank you all so much, and really, really appreciate Roy, Nick.
I got to call out Sally again because I almost did this. She goes, "I don't want to be where the law firms are," sung to the tune of Little Mermaid. I almost did that. I don't want to be where the law firms are. You're my spirit animal, Sally. Thank you.
Love it. Taking us out on a musical note.
Don't forget, if you need help with your brand's podcast, we'd love to have a chat. You can find us at lowerstreet.co. If you'd like more content like this, or to find out information on podcasting events we have coming up in the near future, head to brandpodcastsummit.com.